On a cold morning in 1869, a single mother boards a crowded train with her little boy, clutching her last shred of dignity. Laughter cuts through the rattling wheels as elegant passengers humiliate her for the crime of being poor and exhausted, never imagining that the most feared duke in London is seated just a breath away, listening in silence, fighting a war between his icy reputation and the humanity he buried long ago. What secret from his past will her tears awaken? What will win, duty or desire? Tell me in the comments where you're listening from. And do you believe love can cross class and scandal in historical romances? Bath, England, in the year 1869, was a city where the scent of coal smoke mingled with the sweetness of fresh bread, and where every dawn carried the restless weight of class boundaries that ruled every breath a person took. On a cold spring morning, when the mist still clung to the cobblestones like a thin veil, Annabel Pierce stepped onto the Bath-bound train with her small son, Samuel, held close against her side. The station platform buzzed with murmurs and the clipped steps of polished boots, yet she moved quietly, almost invisibly, as women of her circumstance had learned to do. She wore a dark navy wool dress she had mended countless times, and her faded brown shawl could barely hold back the morning chill. Samuel, only 4 years old, nestled his cheek into her shoulder, sleepy and unaware of the storm, waiting just beyond the train doors. They boarded quickly, finding a narrow seat near the end of the carriage. Annabel lowered Samuel onto her lap, smoothing his curls with a gentle hand. The carriage was filled with well-dressed travellers, gentlemen in tailored coats, ladies wrapped in silk and velvet, faces powdered and gloved, their expressions carved with a certainty that the world existed to serve them. Annabel's presence, the worn fabric of her dress, the tired slump of her posture, stood out like a smudge on polished silver. A pair of women glanced in her direction, their eyes narrowed with disdain. One lifted her chin with an air of expert cruelty. "This carriage is hardly suitable for that sort of company," she whispered loudly enough for the entire row to hear. Another woman tittered behind a lace handkerchief, pretending to hide amusement. Annabel kept her eyes lowered, choosing silence over confrontation. She had learned long ago that dignity did not always win battles, but losing one's temper always lost the war. She pressed Samuel closer. He stirred, rubbing his eyes, and whimpered softly. The sound earned them another round of cold stares. A gentleman with a gold watch chain leaned forward, inspecting them as though they were an inconvenience delivered by fate. "Some of us pay handsomely for peace during travel," he muttered. "Surely there is a more appropriate place for a seamstress and her child." Annabel's cheeks warmed with embarrassment, but she offered no answer. Instead, she whispered to Samuel, promising him they would be home soon, though she had no idea if that was true. Work was scarce, and each journey into Bath carried more desperation than certainty. Samuel snuggled closer, shivering, and another murmur rippled through the carriage. At the far end, hidden behind a neatly folded newspaper, Lionel Astorbury, the Duke of Winthorpe, lowered the page just slightly. Though he wore a modest bowler hat and a charcoal travelling coat designed to draw as little attention as possible, his presence still carried the quiet power of a man accustomed to command. His storm-blue eyes watched the scene unfold with growing tension, though his posture remained still, like a man resisting the impulse to act. He had boarded the train seeking anonymity, hoping to move through the city without society's constant scrutiny. Yet fate, in its peculiar insistence, had placed him directly across from this woman, this fragile figure with exhausted eyes and the gentlest touch he had ever witnessed. Something in him twisted, a feeling he had long buried, and he found himself gripping the edges of his newspaper a little too tightly. A tall, broad-shouldered man in an expensive coat suddenly rose from his seat. He stepped toward Annabel with a look of theatrical indignation. "You are occupying space meant for paying travellers," he barked. "Stand up at once and let a respectable lady sit." Annabel blinked, startled, uncertain whether she had heard correctly. I paid for this seat, sir," she answered softly, her voice trembling yet steady. The man scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. "Do not lie. You belong in the rear carriage. Move aside." Samuel's small hands clutched her dress, sensing danger. Annabel felt her heart race, the humiliation rising like a tide. She took a slow breath, preparing to stand if only to avoid further confrontation. Her pride was nearly worn thin by years of hardship. She no longer had the strength to fight every injustice. The man reached forward, not violently, but with enough force to unbalance her. Gasps echoed, whispers grew louder, and someone murmured, "This is absurd. She should know her place." Annabel steadied herself, shielding Samuel with her arm. Tears stung her eyes, not from fear, but from the piercing ache of being reminded once more that the world believed her worth, measured by the threads of her dress. Then a voice rolled through the carriage, deep, crisp, and commanding enough to halt every whisper. Enough. One word. One syllable spoken with such authority that the air itself seemed to shift. The tall man froze mid-movement, his hand suspended in the air. All eyes darted toward the source of the voice. Lionel Astorbury lowered his newspaper completely. The moment he lifted his gaze, an indescribable silence settled across the carriage. People straightened, as though before a judge. The gentleman who had threatened Annabel stepped back, swallowing hard, suddenly pale. Lionel did not stand. He did not raise his voice. He simply held the man's gaze with a look colder than winter stone. "Return to your seat," he said, each word dripping with restrained fury. "You will not touch her again." The man stumbled backward and sank into his place without protest. Lionel's eyes scanned the rest of the carriage once. No one dared breathe. Annabel blinked, stunned. She did not know his name, nor his rank, nor why such a commanding presence had intervened. But she felt the weight of his protection, a shield she had not asked for, yet desperately needed. Her breath came unsteady, and for a fleeting moment she allowed herself to meet his eyes. And oh, what eyes they were, deep blue storms filled with something she had not seen directed at her in years. Recognition. As though he saw not just her humiliation, but the person she had fought so hard to remain beneath it. Her heart twisted at the intensity of the moment. Lionel held her gaze for a second that stretched like an eternity, then lowered the newspaper once more, concealing whatever emotion flickered inside him. The train began to slow as it approached Bath Spa Station. Annabel rose carefully, gathering Samuel in her arms. She stepped into the aisle, her shawl slipping from her shoulder, and exited the carriage with as much dignity as she could muster. The cold morning air refreshed her lungs, but her mind raced with confusion, gratitude, and something else she could not name. She glanced back through the window. Lionel still sat in his place, motionless, though his gaze followed her until she vanished into the crowd of the platform. He looked down at the newspaper he had not truly read and clenched it slowly, the paper crumpling beneath his fingers. Something had shifted inside him, something quiet yet profound, and he could not explain why. The sight of a weary seamstress with a trembling child had pierced through the armor he had built for so many years. But he did not rise. He did not chase after her. He simply remained seated, unsettled in ways he did not dare to name, as the train prepared to continue its journey, and the weight of one silent moment lingered in the air, like the echo of a storm not yet begun. The morning mist had long lifted over Bath, yet Lionel Astorbury felt as though a cloud still hovered above him, refusing to dissipate. After leaving the train, he had walked the familiar streets with the precision of a man determined to bury his thoughts beneath routine. But routine failed him. Every corner he turned, every step he took, every sound of the bustling city reminded him, against his will, of the woman he had watched suffer in silence. Annabel Pierce. He did not know her name yet, but her presence clung to his mind like the fading scent of a perfume, discovered only once and never forgotten. He had intended to spend the day reviewing business contracts and private correspondence inside the townhouse he kept near Pulteney Street, but the moment he opened the first document, the lines blurred. His advisers spoke, but their words drifted past him like distant whispers. A duke was expected to listen, to measure every financial risk and every political insinuation with icy precision. Yet that morning, Lionel could not summon even a fraction of the cold discipline that had shaped him into the feared man he had become. Instead, he saw a pair of trembling hands clutching a child. He saw worn fabric and quiet dignity. He heard the tremor of a woman's breath as she fought humiliation with the bravery of someone who no longer expected kindness. By midday, Lionel closed the ledger he had not truly read and dismissed his advisers with a curt gesture. He claimed a headache, though the ache was not physical. It came from somewhere deeper, somewhere he rarely allowed himself to examine. He needed air, space, movement, anything that could silence the ghost of a scene that had unsettled him far more than any confrontation within the courts of London or the circles of ruthless tycoons he negotiated with. Outside, Bath shimmered under the pale spring sun. Carriages rattled past elegant Georgian facades, and the air carried the mingled scents of warm bread, horse leather, and distant coal. Yet even the familiar rhythm of the city failed to settle him. He found himself walking without direction, his feet guided more by instinct than intention. Meanwhile, Annabel had begun her own difficult morning, unaware that the Duke who had defended her still carried the weight of that moment. She reached the elegant neighborhood of Mrs. Eleanor Caldwell, her most loyal customer, careful to keep the hem of her dress out of the damp patches along the street. Samuel had stayed with a neighbor, and although the separation eased her arms, it left a hollow ache in her chest. Her son was her entire world, and leaving him with another family, even one she trusted, always made her anxious. Annabel breathed deeply before knocking on Mrs. Caldwell's door. Delivering the gown had taken hours of careful stitching, and she prayed the payment would sustain them for a few more days. When the butler opened the door and ushered her inside, she stepped into the familiar warmth of a home that always made her feel both welcomed and painfully aware of the gulf between their worlds. Mrs. Caldwell awaited her in the drawing room, bathed in the golden glow of a late-morning sunbeam. The older woman's silver-streaked hair framed a face marked by gentle wisdom, and her hazel eyes lit with kindness when she saw Annabel enter. "My dear, you look exhausted," she said, setting aside her teacup. "Sit down before you faint from weariness." Annabel hesitated, unsure whether her patched dress would stain the fine upholstery, but Mrs. Caldwell insisted, guiding her to a nearby chair with maternal firmness. Annabel's throat tightened with gratitude. She presented the completed gown, a soft burgundy piece adorned with delicate lace she had fashioned from leftover trimmings. "It is lovely," Mrs. Caldwell said, admiring the stitching. "You have a gift, Annabel. I hope you know that." Annabel lowered her gaze, embarrassed by praise she rarely heard. "Thank you, madam. I did my best. And your best is remarkable." Mrs. Caldwell reached out, brushing a stray strand of hair from Annabel's face. "I worry for you, child. You work too hard. Your eyes tell the story plainly." Annabel smiled faintly, touched more deeply than she wished to show. "There is simply much to do. Always," Mrs. Caldwell said softly. "But even a seamstress deserves to breathe. Allow yourself a moment, just here, just now." Annabel remained only a few minutes longer, grateful for the warmth of the room and the tenderness of a woman who had become her only source of refuge in a world determined to overlook her. When she left, she carried the payment safely tucked in her pocket, but exhaustion clung to her steps like wet cloth. As evening approached, the city transformed. Vendors called out their last offers in the marketplace, children ran past with laughter trailing behind them, and street lamps flickered to life one by one. Annabel walked through the crowd, balancing a heavy bundle of sewing materials against her hip. She needed thread, fabric, and buttons for future work, though she could scarcely afford them. The weight grew unbearable, and she paused near a fruit merchant's stall to adjust her load. Her arms trembled, and she whispered a quiet prayer for strength. The sky had shifted to a pale lavender, and shadows stretched along the cobblestones. Her shawl slipped from her shoulder, and she struggled to lift the bundle again. "Allow me." The voice was deep, composed, and unmistakably refined. Annabel froze. She knew that voice, though she had heard it only once enough to etch it into her memory. When she turned, her breath caught. It was him, the man from the train. The man who had silenced an entire carriage with a single word. Lionel Astorbury stood before her, illuminated by the soft lantern glow of the marketplace. He wore a charcoal grey coat and a dark cravat, his bowler hat casting a shadow over the sharp lines of his face. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes, those piercing blue eyes, held something she could not decipher. "Please," he said, extending a steady hand. "You should not carry all of that alone." Annabel swallowed hard, her heart fluttering like a trapped bird. She wanted to refuse, to preserve her pride, but the ache in her arms betrayed her. "That is very kind, sir," she murmured, "but I can manage." His brow lifted with a quiet blend of concern and restrained insistence. "You are trembling," he observed. "Let me help." Annabel hesitated. He seemed so certain, so steady, as though offering assistance cost him nothing at all. She allowed him to take part of the burden, and the relief made her shoulders sag. "Thank you," she whispered. He inclined his head, as though the simple word held more weight than she intended. For a moment, neither spoke. They stood in the heart of the marketplace, surrounded by merchants closing their stalls, women haggling for last-minute purchases, and the fading scent of roasted chestnuts. Yet the noise around them felt distant, muffled, as though the world had withdrawn to give them space. Only then did Annabel truly see him. She remembered his voice, the authority that had reverberated through the carriage. Now she looked into his face and recognized the same man whose presence alone had halted cruelty in its tracks. "You are—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "You were on the train." Lionel's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, but enough that she sensed his guarded heart. "Yes," he answered quietly. "I was." Emotion swelled within her. Gratitude, confusion, something far more dangerous. She clutched her shawl to her chest and lowered her gaze. "I did not thank you properly. What you did, it meant more than I can say." "You owe me nothing," he replied, though his voice tremored with something unsaid. "I merely acted as any decent man should." For the first time in years, Annabel felt the stirrings of warmth in the pit of her stomach, a warmth she did not dare name. Lionel's gaze lingered on her longer than necessary, tracing the fatigue etched into her cheeks, the resolute tilt of her chin, the softness she carried despite the weight of her burdens. He cleared his throat softly. "If you would allow it, I can carry this for you a bit farther." "I cannot ask that of you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You did not ask," he replied gently. "I offered." For a few steps, they walked together through the bustling streets of Bath, the evening alive around them with the hum of countless stories. They did not touch, yet the space between them held a tension more palpable than any physical contact. When they reached the edge of the marketplace, Annabel stopped and turned toward him. "This is far enough," she said softly. "Truly." He hesitated, as though reluctant to let the moment end. Then he handed her the bundle with unusual care. Their fingers brushed, just a whisper of contact, but the sensation lingered far longer than it should have. "Good evening, Mrs." He began gently. Annabel held her breath. Revealing her name felt oddly intimate. "Pierce," she said quietly. "Annabel Pierce." Lionel nodded slowly, her name sinking into him like an imprint. "A pleasure, Mrs. Pierce." He stepped back, and the space between them widened. Annabel watched him leave, feeling as though something precious had slipped through her fingers. Lionel walked away with long, measured strides, but each step felt heavy with a conflict he could not quite define. For the first time in many years, the Duke of Winthorpe felt something stir within him, something fragile, dangerous, and profoundly unsettling. Annabel Pierce had entered his world without permission, and without meaning to, she had left a mark he would not easily erase. Bath, in the year 1869, possessed a talent for transforming the simplest whisper into a tempest. A glance exchanged at the wrong moment, a greeting offered in public, even a fleeting pause between two strangers could ignite hours of delicious, merciless conversation among those who fed on gossip as though it were a banquet. And on the morning after, Lionel Astorbury had been seen speaking to a woman of humble means in the bustling marketplace. Bath society feasted well. It began innocently enough. A pair of dressmakers carrying bolts of silk passed two elderly ladies in front of the grocer's shop, exchanging a few careless words about a gentleman who had carried a parcel for a young widow. A clerk from a bookshop overheard just enough to embellish the story before repeating it to Mrs. Graham, who shared it with Mrs. Pritchard over tea. By midday, the tale had expanded like a drop of ink in water. By evening, it had grown into something scandalous. According to the newest, most thrilling version, the Duke of Winthorpe himself had been seen assisting a poor seamstress, as if such a thing were possible, as if a man of his position would ever notice a woman who walked the city with thread-stained fingers and a patched shawl. Most regarded the rumour as absurd at first, but absurdity had never stopped a rumour from taking flight. In fact, it often helped. Lady Henrietta Forsyth heard the whispers before sunset. She stood in her dressing room before a tall mirror framed in carved dark walnut, admiring her reflection as her maid pinned a string of jet beads around her slender neck. Henrietta had always taken great pride in her appearance, with auburn hair styled in elaborate coils and green eyes sharp enough to wound. She carried herself with the confidence of a woman accustomed to being admired. Yet that afternoon, her mirror revealed something unexpected, an imperfection in the cool elegance of her expression, a strain, a crack. "What did you say?" she asked, her voice deceptively calm. The maid hesitated, fingers trembling slightly as she adjusted the clasp. "Only what I heard in the market, madam, that the Duke was seen assisting a woman, a working woman, a seamstress, I believe." Henrietta laughed, though the sound was brittle. "Nonsense. Lionel would never involve himself in such matters." The maid nodded quickly. "Of course, madam." But as Henrietta dismissed her and remained alone with her reflection, the brittle smile vanished. A seamstress, a nobody, a woman without a name, without lineage, without a single drop of social power. How could such a creature have crossed Lionel's path, let alone attracted his attention? Her jaw clenched. A seamstress was harmless, but a rumour was not. A rumour could plant seeds in Lionel's mind, seeds of rebellion against the expectations of society, and Henrietta had spent years cultivating her proximity to him, ensuring she remained a potential choice should he ever decide to remarry. She would not allow some thread-worn girl to interfere with that. Meanwhile, Annabel Pierce knew nothing of the whispers spreading like wildfire across Bath. Her world had shrunk to the small room she shared with her son, where Samuel lay curled beneath a thin blanket, his cheeks flushed with the faint hue of fever. Annabel sat beside him, pressing a cool cloth to his forehead. Her heart tightened each time he whimpered. "Rest, my love," she murmured. "Mamma is here." His breathing deepened, thick with congestion. He clung to her fingers, trusting her completely, and the weight of that trust pressed into her chest like a stone. She had so little to give him, yet he never doubted. He never questioned. She wished she had his faith. After a long moment watching him sleep, she rose, smoothing her dress reluctantly. She needed to work. Any hour she spent sitting at Samuel's bedside was an hour she did not earn coins to keep them housed and fed. Gathering her sewing tools and the few materials she possessed, she moved to the small table by the window and lit the lamp, whose flame flickered weakly in the dimming light. Her head throbbed with fatigue, her hands ached, but she bent over the cloth and continued stitching, careful and precise. The thread slipped through the needle in slow repetition, creating tiny, perfect lines that glimmered in the lamplight. Each stitch was a silent promise to her son that she would not fail him, not even now. Yet worry consumed her. How would she sustain the coming days if Samuel worsened? What if she could not deliver the garments on time? What if the fever rose during the night? She pressed her lips together, forcing her trembling fingers to remain steady. Across the city, Lionel Astorbury sat in his study, attempting to engage with a series of reports laid out before him. His advisor, Walter Pembroke, a thin man with a nervous manner and spectacles perched precariously on the bridge of his nose, stood nearby, reading aloud from a document concerning trade contracts and industrial concerns. But Lionel heard nothing. His mind was elsewhere. He could still see Annabel's eyes when she realized he had helped her. The way she had struggled to remain composed, the way her voice had wavered, yet held an honesty that few dared offer him. He had encountered countless people, dukes, tycoons, social climbers, politicians, but never someone who wore their hardship with such fragile grace. "Your Grace?" Walter's timid voice broke through the fog in Lionel's thoughts. "Forgive me," Lionel said curtly. "Repeat the last point." Walter cleared his throat. "There are additional matters, Your Grace, matters of a more delicate nature." Lionel lifted his gaze slowly. "Speak plainly." Well, sir," Walter stuttered, "there are rumors circulating concerning you." Lionel's expression hardened. "What kind of rumors?" Walter swallowed. "That you were seen assisting a woman of modest means in the marketplace, a seamstress, and that you—" Lionel stood abruptly, his chair scraping softly across the floor. Walter staggered back. "That is enough," Lionel said in a low voice that vibrated with dangerous restraint. "I do not care to hear the rest." Walter nodded rapidly, relieved. But Lionel's fury simmered, not at Annabel, never at her. It was the insatiable hunger of society that enraged him, its desire to consume every private moment, to twist even the smallest display of human decency into scandal. A seamstress. They spoke of her as if the word itself were offensive. He paced the room, jaw locked, hands clasped behind his back. Her face rose before him again, more vivid than the room itself. "I must find her," he murmured under his breath, startling himself with the admission. Walter blinked. "Your Grace?" "Nothing," Lionel said sharply. But he knew it was not nothing. He could not explain it, not even to himself. But he felt compelled, drawn by an invisible thread stronger than reason. He needed to see her, to ensure she was safe, to understand why their brief encounters had unsettled him so profoundly. He donned his coat and stepped into the cold evening air. His breath fogged before him as he walked, the gas lamps casting long golden beams across the streets. He chose a path toward the marketplace, hoping, though he would not admit it, that fate might allow their paths to cross again. Annabel remained at her sewing table, lost in worry as the lamp burned low. Samuel whimpered once more, and she pressed a kiss to his forehead, whispering soothing words. Her heart felt stretched thin, fragile as lace worn too many years, yet she continued working, guided by a mother's fierce love. Lionel walked past the marketplace, then down a narrow lane lined with shuttered shops and flickering lanterns. His steps slowed as he approached the small cluster of homes where he remembered seeing her disappear days before. He did not know her exact address, nor what he would say if he found her, but his chest felt tight with something dangerously close to hope. Annabel lifted her head as the faint sound of footsteps echoed outside her window. A strange shiver traveled down her spine. She rose and stepped toward the curtains, hesitating before pulling them back just enough to see the street. A tall figure walked past, silhouetted in lamplight. His coat fluttered slightly with the breeze, and his bowler hat cast a shadow over his face. She could not discern his features, but she felt her breath catch. She did not know that the man was searching for her, and he did not know that she stood only a few steps away, separated by a thin pane of glass and a destiny neither dared name. Yet something in that quiet moment, two hearts unknowingly aligned, sent a tremor through the city's gossip-hungry air. Bath had begun to whisper, but the whispers were nothing compared to what was coming. Bath, in the year 1869, awoke under a pale, uncertain sun. A thin veil of morning mist drifted across the river like a fragile promise of warmth that had yet to arrive. The water glimmered faintly in shades of soft grey and silver, reflecting the hesitant light of early day. Along the riverbank, where the city's hum softened into a quieter rhythm, Annabel Pierce knelt in the cold, damp grass, her sleeves rolled up as she washed Samuel's fever cloths in the frigid water. Her hands trembled with exhaustion. The chill bit through her skin, numbing her fingers until she could scarcely feel the cloth between them. Yet she continued, her movements deliberate and steady. Samuel lay bundled nearby atop a folded blanket, sleeping fitfully, his small body curled into itself. His breath came in raspy waves that made her heart clench each time she listened. Annabel dipped another cloth into the river, watching the water ripple outward in delicate circles. She pressed it between her fingers to wring it out, then paused, her gaze drifting toward her son. His cheeks were flushed, though less so than the night before. She prayed silently that the fever would not rise again, for she could not afford a proper physician. Every spare coin had already been stretched thin to feed him, to keep them sheltered, to pay for the fabric she needed for her work. The river's current whispered against the shore. A gust of wind lifted a strand of hair from her cheek. She tucked it behind her ear with a trembling hand, her thoughts drowned in worry. She did not hear the approaching footsteps at first. They were soft, measured, almost reluctant. But something, a shift in the air, a quiet instinct, made her lift her gaze. Lionel Astorbury stood a few paces behind her. The Duke of Winthorpe had never seemed more out of place or more painfully present. His charcoal-grey coat, tailored with immaculate precision, brushed the tops of the tall grass. His dark cravat framed the strong lines of his jaw, and his bowler hat cast a protective shade over his storm-blue eyes. Yet nothing about his attire distracted from the tension etched across his face, a tension carved by worry, anger, and something deeper he could not name. "Mrs. Pierce," he said softly, his voice carrying the gravity of a man who rarely allowed concern to surface. Annabel gasped and rose hastily, nearly losing her balance on the damp earth. Sir," she stuttered, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. She clutched the damp cloths to her chest, painfully aware of how disheveled she must look. He took a step closer, though he maintained a respectful distance. "Forgive me. I did not mean to startle you." She swallowed, unable to meet his eyes for long. "What brings you here?" His gaze drifted to Samuel's small, sleeping form. "I was searching for you," he admitted reluctantly, the honesty surprising even him. "Your son is ill." Annabel's throat tightened. "It is only a fever. Children fall ill often. Children also grow weaker if their fevers are not treated." His tone was calm, but his brows knit in concern. "You have been washing cloths in freezing water. You are cold and exhausted, and your son needs medical attention." Annabel turned away, her shoulders tightening. Shame pressed down on her chest like a weight she could not lift. "I cannot summon a physician," she whispered. "I do not have the means." Lionel stepped forward, though he stopped short of touching her. "Then let me summon one." "No," she said quickly, almost desperately. "I cannot accept something so costly." "It is not charity," Lionel said quietly. "It is necessity." Annabel shook her head, tears stinging her eyes. "Sir, I cannot afford the debt. I cannot owe a man like you anything." Lionel's expression softened with a tenderness she had never seen in him before, not on the train, not in the marketplace. "You owe me nothing," he said. "Nothing at all. Allow me to help because your son needs help." Her breath hitched. She looked at Samuel again, his small chest rising and falling with uneven rhythm. Love overwhelmed her pride. She knew she could not risk losing him. With a trembling voice, she whispered, "Very well. If the physician can come, then—" "Yes." Lionel nodded once sharply, as though sealing a vow. "I will bring him at once." He turned and walked away with purposeful strides, leaving Annabel standing breathless beside the river. She watched his tall figure disappear around a bend in the path, the cold morning air tightening around her chest, not from fear, but from something dangerously close to relief. Within the hour, Lionel returned with a local physician, Dr. Aldridge, a stout man with thinning hair and a brisk manner. He knelt beside Samuel, examining the child with gentle but practiced hands. Annabel hovered nearby, wringing her hands, each second stretching painfully. "The fever is mild," Dr. Aldridge announced after several tense moments. "The child is weakened, but not in danger. He needs warmth, rest, and broth. His mother's care has prevented the fever from worsening." Annabel breathed out, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. Lionel, standing just behind her, saw the way her shoulders shook and stepped closer, though he resisted the impulse to offer more than silent support. "I will prepare what he needs," Annabel whispered. "Thank you." Dr. Aldridge rose. "I will leave instructions. Keep him warm, change the cloths frequently, and do not let the mother exhaust herself beyond reason." He glanced at Lionel with a knowing look, as though guessing the source of the unexpected assistance. Lionel followed the doctor a few steps away to settle payment. Annabel did not hear their exchange, but she sensed the generosity Lionel offered. She felt torn, grateful, indebted, and strangely exposed. When the doctor left, Lionel returned to her side. Samuel slept more soundly, his breathing steadier. Annabel knelt beside him, brushing a hand across his hair. The fear that had consumed her began to ease, replaced by a fragile peace. "You saved him," she murmured, her voice raw. "If not for you, I would not have known what to do." Lionel knelt beside her, though he kept a respectful distance. "You saved him," he corrected gently. "I only did what any man with eyes could have done." She turned toward him, her cheeks still damp. Their gazes met, slowly, irresistibly, and something inside her trembled at the intensity within his eyes. It was not pity, it was not obligation. It was something far more complicated, something that made her heartbeat stumble. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered. Lionel's breath caught in his throat. He had no answer he could safely offer, not one that would not frighten her, not one that would not frighten him. He looked away first. "You should not be here alone," he said instead. "If you ever need assistance, you may seek me out." Annabel's lips parted, but the words died on her tongue. She was too overwhelmed, too conflicted by the warmth and tension woven between them. They sat together for a quiet moment, the river murmuring beside them, the breeze carrying the faint scent of blooming thyme from nearby fields. The air felt heavy with unspoken truths, fragile yet undeniable. Then Lionel rose. "I should go," he said, though his voice revealed reluctance. Annabel nodded. "Thank you," she whispered again, "for everything." He stared at her a long moment, too long, before turning away. But fate, cruel and sharp-edged, had not finished with them. As Lionel walked through the narrow path, leading away from Annabel's district, a tall figure watched from behind a stone archway. Lady Henrietta Forsyth's green eyes blazed with fury as she saw the Duke leave the humble neighborhood. Her breath tightened with indignation. Her gloves creaked as her hands curled into fists. So the rumors were true. And worse, Lionel had come alone without carriage or escort, as though this woman, this seamstress, this nobody, had drawn him here with invisible threads she could not bear to imagine. Lady Henrietta's lips curled into a thin, venomous smile. Bath would hear of this before sunset. True to her nature, she spread the story with calculated precision, infusing every retelling with poison. By the time Lionel reached his townhouse, he was met with the first whispers echoing across the city. His jaw tightened, his eyes flashed. He found Lady Henrietta that same evening at a gathering hosted by a wealthy family on Pulteney Street. She was radiant in emerald silk and feigned innocence as he approached, but Lionel's expression was carved from stone. "I am aware of your behavior," he said in a voice so cold it silenced nearby conversation. "You will cease spreading tales about matters you do not understand." Henrietta lifted her chin, her smile sweet and venomous. "I only repeat what I saw." "You saw nothing," Lionel replied sharply, "but your malice is unmistakable." Her cheeks flushed with a fury she could not conceal. "You risk much," she whispered, "for a woman beneath you." Lionel leaned close enough that she felt the chill of his anger. "And you risk far more, Lady Henrietta, by assuming authority over my affairs. Consider this your final warning." She stiffened. Her eyes glittered with wounded pride and simmering jealousy. And in that moment she made a silent vow. She would not be defeated, she would not be ignored, and she would not let Annabel Pierce walk untouched through the fire she herself would now ignite. The night grew colder, and Bath, ever hungry for tragedy, waited eagerly for the next spark. Bath, in the year 1869, was a city built of stone and pride. Every whisper found its echo along Georgian terraces, slipping under doors and settling into drawing rooms where the well-to-do gathered to judge the world beyond their windows. By the morning after Lionel's confrontation with Lady Henrietta, those whispers had transformed into a merciless wave that crashed directly upon Annabel Pierce's fragile world. The scandal began quietly, carried on the swift tongues of women who adored misfortune when it did not belong to them. A seamstress seen in the company of a duke, a widow receiving the kind of attention that would make a proper lady's pulse quicken with envy. A child, ill, trembling, wrapped in a threadbare blanket, whose mother had apparently entangled the Duke of Winthorpe in her struggles. By noon the simple rumour had grown teeth. Clients who had smiled at Annabel days before, praising her careful stitches and swift work, now sent curt notes cancelling commissions without explanation. Some claimed sudden travel plans, others pretended illness. A few, less delicate, instructed her not to return, warning that they did not wish to be associated with a woman entangled in impropriety. Annabel read each message with shaking hands. Her heart sank deeper with each sealed envelope she opened. She had done nothing wrong, yet society had already decided she was guilty. By late afternoon, the small basket where she kept her coins remained tragically light. Only one envelope remained unopened, a parchment sealed with an elegant crest belonging to Mrs. Eleanor Caldwell. Annabel held her breath as she broke the seal. "My dear Annabel, please join me tomorrow for an intimate gathering. I insist you attend." With affection, E. Caldwell Annabel pressed the letter to her chest, eyes closing in relief. Mrs. Caldwell had always been kind, always treated her as more than a pair of hands meant to serve. But attending a gathering, especially now, with her name being scraped across Bath's social circles like ink on dry parchment, filled her with dread. Still, she had no choice. She would attend. She owed Mrs. Caldwell respect, and she needed the small comfort of a friendly face. The next day arrived crisp and bright, as though the sun itself wished to contradict the heaviness weighing upon her. Annabel dressed carefully in her navy wool gown, the dress she wore for all solemn tasks. She pinned her hair neatly, straightened her bonnet ribbon, and walked with measured steps toward Mrs. Caldwell's residence. The house stood proudly near the river, its stone facade warmed by morning light. When Annabel knocked, the butler welcomed her inside with gentle courtesy, guiding her into a drawing room filled with soft floral patterns and delicate porcelain. The moment she entered, Annabel felt it. The stares. Women seated on plush chairs turned to look at her, slowly, deliberately, each expression dripping with judgment, disguised as curiosity. Their fans fluttered like restless wings, hiding lips twisted with poorly veiled disdain. A few whispered behind gloved hands, their eyes sweeping over Annabel's simple dress and faded shawl with appreciative malice. Annabel's steps faltered. She clutched her hands together to still their tremble. Mrs. Caldwell rose immediately and crossed the room with open arms. "My dear," she said warmly, kissing Annabel's cheek, "thank you for coming." Annabel held onto the softness of that welcome as though it were the only safe ground in a storm. "Please, sit with me," Mrs. Caldwell insisted. "There is someone I believe you should speak with." Annabel followed her to a small cluster of seats near the window. She dared a brief glance outside, where the gardens shimmered under the sun. The world beyond the walls felt kinder, freer, untouched by the venom of society. She wished she were out there instead. Moments later, the butler's voice rang through the doorway. "The Duke of Winthorpe." The room fell silent. Every fan stilled, every spine straightened, even the teacups seemed to cease their soft clinking. Annabel froze. Lionel entered with quiet command, his presence filling the room in an instant. He wore a dark coat that enhanced the breadth of his shoulders, and his storm-blue eyes scanned the room with an expression perfectly carved, revealing nothing, except when he saw her. In that moment, something flickered across his face, a softness, an undeniable warmth that no one else would have noticed unless they were watching him with a desperate heart. Annabel felt her breath catch. Mrs. Caldwell hid a small smile behind her teacup. "Your Grace," she said, greeting him with practiced elegance, "thank you for joining us. I trust you have met Mrs. Pierce." Lionel bowed his head to Annabel. "Indeed," he said quietly. "It is good to see you again." His voice, deep and controlled, sent an involuntary shiver through her. She nodded, her cheeks warming at the attention. The room seemed to lean in, to observe, to devour every syllable and glance exchanged between them. "We were just beginning tea," Mrs. Caldwell said lightly. "Please join us." Lionel accepted the offered seat, directly beside Annabel. Her pulse quickened. She tried to focus on her teacup, but her senses were attuned entirely to him. The slight shift of his coat fabric as he sat, the faint scent of cedar and crisp linen, the presence that radiated heat even from a respectful distance. He did not touch her. He did not lean close. Yet their proximity was enough to fill the air with tension so delicate it trembled like a harp string. "Mrs. Pierce," Lionel murmured just for her ears, "how fares your son?" Annabel's breath shuddered softly. She kept her voice steady. "Better, sir, because of your help." Their eyes met. A quiet, undeniable truth passed between them. They were no longer strangers, but society would not let them forget the boundaries they were stepping across. From the far corner of the room, Lady Henrietta Forsyth stood in an exquisite gown of emerald silk, the colour chosen deliberately to command attention. Her auburn hair gleamed under the chandelier, but her eyes, sharp and green as polished glass, were fixed on Annabel with poisonous fury. She glided toward the group with an elegant smile that made Annabel's stomach twist. "How lovely," Henrietta said sweetly. "Mrs. Pierce, is it?" Annabel nodded cautiously. Henrietta took a slow sip of tea. "I had not realized Mrs. Caldwell extended her hospitality so widely." The insult hung in the air like a dagger. Before Annabel could respond, Henrietta went on, her voice dripping with venom masked as concern. "And you are a widow, I hear. Such a burden, managing poverty and chilled rearing alone. It must be exhausting." Annabel's cheeks burned, pain pricked behind her eyes, but Henrietta was not finished. "Tell us, how does one explain attracting the attention of a duke while living in such circumstances?" The room tensed. Annabel felt as though the floor had opened beneath her feet. Lionel's cup clattered softly as he set it down with controlled force. "Lady Henrietta," he said, every syllable icy and precise, "you will stop at once." Henrietta stiffened, taken aback but not defeated. "I merely wish to understand." "There is nothing for you to understand," Lionel interrupted sharply. "Mrs. Pierce is under my protection." Gasps echoed across the room. Fans snapped open in shock. Annabel's heart pounded violently. Under his protection. The words were too large, too heavy, too filled with meaning she did not dare interpret. Henrietta's face paled. Shame, rage, and disbelief warred in her expression. "Your Grace, you cannot be serious." Lionel stood. His height, his bearing, his authority transformed the room into a chamber of judgment. "I am entirely serious." His voice softened only when he turned to Annabel. "You owe no one an explanation," he said quietly. least of all those who take pleasure in cruelty. Her eyes filled with tears she did not want anyone to see. She rose abruptly. "Excuse me," she whispered. She fled before the first tear could fall. As she stepped into the hallway, the air tasted of freedom and devastation. She pressed a hand to her mouth to stifle a sob, her heart aching fiercely. She felt humiliated, exposed, overwhelmed. Yet beneath the pain pulsed something tender and dangerous. Lionel had defended her, publicly, fiercely. He had chosen her side. Outside, the sun dipped lower, casting long golden beams across the marble staircase as she hurried toward the exit. Her vision blurred, her breath uneven. She longed for silence, for safety, for a moment alone to gather the shreds of her dignity. But even as she fled, even as shame and gratitude tangled within her chest, she could not deny it. A part of her, small, trembling, impossible to silence, felt something close to hope. Bath, in the year 1869, lay under the hush of an early evening sky, where the last rays of sunlight dissolved into soft lavender shadows. Along the quiet lanes of the modest district where Annabel Pierce lived, the world seemed distant from the grandeur and scrutiny of society. Here, the houses were simple, the doors worn smooth by time, and the air carried the faint scent of hearth smoke and damp earth. It was a place where lives unfolded quietly, unseen and unprotected. Lionel Astorbury had never walked these streets before. Yet that evening, he moved through them with a determination sharpened by guilt, duty, and something far more unsettling: emotion. He wore no grand coat embroidered with prestige, only a subdued charcoal one meant to disguise his status. But even stripped of outward symbols, the Duke carried an aura that parted the shadows around him with every step. His jaw was set, his eyes fixed ahead, each stride propelled by a purpose he could no longer deny. He needed to see her. He needed to speak to her. He needed to explain what even he barely understood. Annabel had fled Mrs. Caldwell's gathering hours earlier, her heart crushed beneath the weight of humiliation and Lionel's fierce public defense. He had watched her leave, unable to follow then, unable to expose her to even more scrutiny. But he had not forgotten the anguish in her eyes. He could not let the night pass without confronting the truths that had begun to unravel inside him. When he reached her small home, he paused, breath shallow. A gentle glow shone through the thin curtains, flickering like a fragile heartbeat. He raised his hand to knock, then hesitated. Uncertainty, an emotion he rarely permitted himself, momentarily stalling him. Finally he exhaled and knocked softly. Annabel appeared at the door moments later, her bonnet removed and her hair gathered in loose, tired coils. Her dress was still the navy one she had worn to the tea, though now it seemed more rumpled, as though she had collapsed into a chair, without strength to change. Her eyes held traces of dried tears. When she saw him, she froze. "Sir," she whispered, her voice a thread of breath. Why have you come?" Lionel removed his hat, holding it at his side like a man approaching a sacred space. "May I come in, Mrs. Pierce?" Annabel hesitated. His presence filled the small doorway, overwhelming in its intensity. She lowered her gaze, uncertain whether allowing him inside would bring comfort or further chaos. Yet something in Lionel's expression, an unguarded, vulnerable flicker, softened the fear tightening her chest. "Very well," she whispered at last. She stepped aside. Lionel entered, ducking slightly beneath the low frame. The room was small but warm, illuminated by the gentle glow of a single lamp. Samuel slept on a nearby cot, bundled in blankets, his face peaceful. The sight softened Lionel's features more than Annabel expected. "I am relieved to see he is resting," Lionel murmured. Annabel nodded, folding her hands before her. "His fever has eased since yesterday. I am grateful." Silence stretched between them, filled with the rhythmic crackle of the small hearth fire. Lionel's eyes drifted over the room, the humble furnishings, the neatly folded sewing cloths, the worn but carefully maintained belongings. This was the life she had carved out of hardship, a life society dismissed without thought. He turned back to her. "I came because I owe you an explanation." Annabel blinked, startled. "An explanation, sir, you do not—" "I do," he interrupted, his voice gentle but firm. "After what occurred today, after the cruelty you endured because of my presence, I cannot allow misunderstanding to add to your suffering." Annabel's breath trembled. She looked away. "It is I who should apologize. I did not mean to cause trouble for you." "You did not cause trouble," he said quietly. "Others did. Others who enjoy tearing down those they believe beneath them." Ooh. His tone darkened at the memory of Lady Henrietta's venomous humiliation. Annabel saw the tension in his jaw, and guilt twisted inside her. "Sir," she murmured softly, "your defense today, it was too generous, too kind. You should not have placed yourself between me and Lady Henrietta." Lionel stepped closer, only a few inches, but enough to shift the air between them, enough to make Annabel's breath catch. "I do not regret defending you," he said in a low voice. "What I regret is arriving too late to spare you the pain she inflicted." Annabel's lips parted, but she could not speak. Something in the depth of his tone, an honesty unfiltered by rank or decorum, cut through the doubt and fear that had swarmed her all day. Lionel took a slow breath, steadying himself. "Mrs. Pierce, I have spent most of my life judging others from a distance, maintaining barriers carefully constructed to protect my position and my pride. But you—" He paused, searching her face, as though the next words required permission to be spoken. "You have unsettled those barriers, without meaning to, without knowing." Annabel's heart fluttered wildly. Her fingers curled into her skirt, gripping the fabric to steady herself. "Sir, why would I have such an effect on you?" Lionel closed his eyes for a moment, as though the truth cost him something to reveal. "Because I recognize your strength," he said softly. "Because your dignity in the face of cruelty shames those who claim to be above you, and because your suffering mirrors a truth I have carried for too long." Her breath hitched. What truth? His gaze locked with hers, raw, unguarded, stripped of the armor he wore before the world. "Mrs. Pierce, I was married once." The confession fell into the quiet room like a stone into still water. Annabel's eyes widened. I did not know. Few do, and fewer still know the truth behind it." Lionel's voice dropped to a low, pained whisper. "My wife betrayed me with a man I trusted, a man I considered a brother." Annabel's hand lifted to her mouth, covering a small gasp. He continued, the words spilling from a wound, long sealed but never healed. "The scandal nearly destroyed my family's name. Even after her passing, society whispered that the fault lay with me, that I was cold, unfeeling, incapable of inspiring loyalty." He looked away, jaw tight. "I allowed myself to believe them. I built walls. I shut the world out. Better silence than the humiliation of being seen as less than a man." Annabel's eyes shimmered. She took a small step toward him, her voice trembling. "I am so sorry." The sincerity in her tone shook something inside him. "I do not share this lightly," Lionel said, meeting her gaze again. "But after what happened today, you deserve to know why I reacted as I did. Why I could not bear to watch you endure what I once endured myself." Annabel's breath deepened, her heart swelling with a compassion she had not expected to feel. For a duke, no less. But pain recognizes pain. And in Lionel's confession, she heard the echo of her own losses, her own disappointments, her own scars. "Sir," she whispered, "you are not the man society paints you to be." He inhaled sharply, emotion flashing across his features like lightning. "And you, Mrs. A. Pierce, are not the woman society condemns you as." Their gazes locked. The room grew smaller, the air heavier, charged with an unspoken longing neither dared name. Annabel's voice softened to a fragile whisper. "What happens now?" Lionel took a step toward her, slow, hesitant, yet undeniably drawn. "Now," he murmured, "I will protect your name as fiercely as I protect my own." A soft knock shattered the spell between them. They both turned as Walter Pembroke entered the doorway, breathless and pale, clearly torn between propriety and urgency. "My apologies, Your Grace," he said, voice trembling. "But you must hear this. I have proof. Proof that Lady Henrietta has been spreading malicious falsehoods. And she has involved others." Lionel's expression hardened in an instant. The tenderness vanished, replaced by grim resolve. "Show me everything," he said. Walter bowed and stepped back. Lionel turned to Annabel, his tone softer once more. "This is not over," he said quietly. "I will not allow anyone, to wound you again." Annabel's voice wavered. "Be careful." His eyes softened. "Always." And as he stepped into the night, leaving Annabel with her sleeping son, and a heart trembling with impossible new emotions, Lionel carried with him a vow that would change everything. Lady Henrietta had awakened the anger of a man who had lived too long behind walls. And now, for the first time in years, Lionel Astorbury was ready to break them down. Bath, in the year 1869, carried an air of early spring restlessness. Clouds drifted low over the stone rooftops, and the narrow streets glistened where the morning mist clung to the cobblestones. To the wealthy, the day promised a string of idle visits and pleasant gossip. To the working class, it was nothing more than another day to survive. To Annabel Pierce, it was the day her world would finally crack. She awoke before dawn, her body heavy from hours of stitching after Samuel had fallen asleep. Her small room smelled of fabric, soap, and the faint traces of broth she had prepared for him the night before. The boy slept peacefully, curled on his side, his little hand gripping the edge of the blanket. Relief warmed her chest the moment she saw him breathing steadily. His fever had not returned. Thank God. She kissed his cheek softly, then gathered her sewing bag, careful not to make noise. She whispered to the neighbor who had agreed to check in on Samuel during the hours she would be away, then stepped onto the street. She had work to deliver, accounts to settle, and a dozen uncertainties weighing on her heart. Uncertainties born of Lionel Astorbury's confession, his vow to protect her, and the terrible trembling spark that kindled between them. But she carried all of it quietly, the way she carried every burden, unseen, unheard, uncomplaining. The first whisper of danger reached her before she even knocked on Mrs. Harland's townhouse door. Two maids lingered on the steps, their voices low. Their gazes slid to Annabel, sharp and intrusive. "That's her," one murmured. "She looks exactly as they said." Annabel froze. Her hands tightened around the strap of her sewing bag, but she forced herself to breathe and knocked. Mrs. Harland, a stout woman with round cheeks and a brisk manner, greeted her. "Ah, Mrs. Pierce. Yes, yes, come in. I've been expecting you. We must discuss the alterations." Annabel entered the grand house, acutely aware of the servants watching her with eyes bright from rumour. She tried to move with confidence, but unease tugged at her pulse. After reviewing the gown in the drawing room, Mrs. Harland handed her a brooch belonging to a friend. "She wants something similar embroidered on her collar," the lady explained. "Study the detail and bring it back next week." Annabel examined the brooch respectfully before returning it to Mrs. Harland's waiting hand. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming, just another part of her daily work. Until it wasn't. Annabel left the house, stepping into the cool morning air. She walked several paces before she noticed it, an odd weight in her sewing bag. She frowned and placed the bag on a low stone wall, loosening the ties. Her breath caught. Inside, among her spools of thread and carefully folded muslin, lay a glimmer of gold and sapphire. The brooch, the one she had returned only minutes before. Her stomach plummeted. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, no, this is not mine." Footsteps echoed sharply behind her. "There!" a maid cried. "Mrs. Harland, she's taken it." Annabel turned in horror as the maid from earlier marched forward, triumph flashing in her eyes. Behind her came Mrs. Harland, pale and trembling with indignation. "Mrs. Pierce," she said in a taut, cold voice, "explain yourself." Annabel's lips parted, but air refused to come. She could only shake her head, her fingers trembling violently. "I did not take it," she whispered. "I swear it. I returned it to you myself." The maid scoffed loudly. "Yet there it is, in your own bag." Mrs. Harland's expression darkened with disappointment and alarm. "I trusted you." Annabel forced herself to breathe. "Someone must have placed it there. Please, madam, I would never—" But the whispers began at once, slithering through the air. "A thief! I thought widows like her had low morals. She must have planned it. Imagine, stealing from Mrs. Harland." Annabel stumbled backward as the words crashed over her in suffocating waves. Her heart hammered painfully against her ribs. Shame scorched her cheeks like fire. "I would never do such a thing," she said again, but her voice had become small, weak, swallowed by the crowd that had begun to gather. Mrs. Harland's lips pressed into a thin line. "Leave my property immediately, and do not return." Annabel's knees nearly buckled. The maid smirked. Annabel turned and fled. Her tears blurred the street. Her breath came in jagged bursts. She felt as though every door she passed, every window she glimpsed, hid an unseen pair of eyes, watching her downfall. She reached a quiet alley behind the marketplace and collapsed against the brick wall, pressing a trembling hand to her mouth to stifle her sobs. Someone had done this deliberately. Someone had wanted this. Her mind flashed to Lady Henrietta, her cold eyes, her cruel smile, her cutting words at Mrs. Caldwell's tea. Had she? Annabel squeezed her eyes shut. She could not bring herself to believe such malice existed. But oh, it did. And Lionel, dear God, Lionel, he would be dragged into this scandal, stained by association with a woman's society now branded a thief. She felt sick. She could not allow that to happen. Across the city, Lionel Astorbury stood in his study, his anger simmering like a storm ready to break. Walter Pembroke remained at his side, clutching a stack of notes and testimonies. "Are you certain of this?" Lionel asked, his voice low and lethal. Walter nodded shakily. "Lady Henrietta bribed Mrs. Harland's maid. Several servants overheard the conversation. There is no doubt the brooch was planted." Lionel closed his eyes, his fists curling at his sides. Rage roared through him, a rage sharpened by guilt, fear, and something else he refused to name. "She dared to set a trap," he said. "She dared to drag Annabel into this filth." Walter swallowed hard. "What will you do, Your Grace?" Lionel lifted his coat from the chair, his expression carved from unyielding stone. "I will make certain Lady Henrietta understands the cost of harming an innocent woman." He marched from the house like a man possessed. Within the hour, he stood in Lady Henrietta's parlour, where she welcomed him with a smile so sweet it turned his stomach. "Your Grace," she purred. "What a delightful surprise." Lionel did not return her smile. "You orchestrated today's scandal," he said, voice quiet enough to terrify. Her smile faltered for only a moment before she regained her composure. "I don't know what you mean." "Save your false innocence," Lionel snapped. "I know everything. You bribed a maid. You planted evidence. You humiliated a woman whose only crime was existing beyond your petty expectations." Henrietta stiffened. "I protected society. I protected you. That woman is dangerous, Your Grace. She seeks to ensnare you." Lionel stepped closer, his voice ablade. "No, Lady Henrietta. She seeks only to care for her son. It is you who is dangerous." Her eyes widened, breath catching. "We are finished," Lionel said. "You will not speak my name again. You will not speak hers. And if you dare to act against her family once more—" He leaned in, his tone a whisper of pure warning. "You will regret it." Henrietta trembled, but beneath her fear, Lionel saw something darker ignite. He left before she could see the flicker of his own uncertainty. When Lionel arrived at Annabel's home that evening, her door was closed, her windows dark, her presence gone. The neighbour met him outside, wringing her hands anxiously. "Mrs. Pierce left a few hours ago," she said. "She took her son and a small bag. She said she would not bring more trouble upon good people. She said it was better to leave." Lionel's breath left him in a single, devastating exhale. Annabel had vanished. Fled from humiliation, fled from cruelty, fled from him. And Lionel stood in the fading daylight, realizing with a shock that cut into his very soul that he needed her more than he had ever dared to admit. But she was gone, and Bath, merciless, unforgiving Bath, had driven her away. Lionel closed his eyes, fighting the burn rising in his throat. He would find her. Even if it cost him everything, he would find her. Bath, in the year 1869, lay smothered beneath a heavy dusk sky. The evening fog rolled in silently, softening the sharp lines of the city and swallowing the gas lamps one by one until the streets glowed in muted halos of amber. The air tasted of damp stone and the sorrow of unfinished goodbyes. Lionel Astorbury moved swiftly through the fading light, his steps echoing with urgency. His breath formed white clouds before him as he crossed the narrow lanes toward the train station, his senses sharpened by fear and something far more dangerous, hope. Every moment he imagined Annabel farther from him tightened the vice around his chest. He could not lose her, not like this, not without a word spoken or a truth confessed. He reached the station gates just as a distant whistle cut through the air. Inside, the station was nearly deserted, the great arched windows reflecting only the dull glow of lanterns. A single train sat on the tracks, its engine hissing quietly as though impatient for departure. A handful of travellers waited nearby, huddled beneath coats, speaking in low murmurs. And there, near the far end of the platform, stood Annabel Pierce. Her figure was small and heartbreakingly alone against the vast emptiness of the station. She wore her plain navy dress and a shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Samuel lay asleep against her chest, his face tucked into the curve of her neck, his breath light and soft. At her feet sat a modest suitcase, worn so heavily it seemed to carry not just belongings, but years of hardship. Annabel lifted her gaze. Their eyes met. Lionel stopped. His breath caught painfully in his throat. "Mrs. Pierce," he whispered, though the distance between them swallowed the sound. Annabel stiffened. For a moment, she looked as though she might run. Then, gathering her courage, she turned fully toward him. Lionel approached slowly, as though afraid any sudden movement might shatter the fragile space between them. His heart hammered with a force he had not felt since boyhood, pounding against the prison of his chest. When he stopped only a step away, the intensity between them became nearly unbearable. "You are leaving," he said, his voice raw. Annabel swallowed. "Yes, without telling me." Her gaze trembled. "Telling you would have made it harder." "Harder for whom?" Her lips parted, but the answer remained trapped behind fear. "I cannot stay," she whispered at last. "You know that." Lionel shook his head sharply. "No, I refuse to accept that. You were framed, wronged. I am already investigating the matter." "That is exactly why I must go," Annabel interrupted, her voice swelling with painful urgency. "You are a duke. Your name carries weight. Your future, your reputation, they are too important." She gently adjusted Samuel in her arms, as though tightening the protective hold she had on him. "My staying here puts everything you are at risk," she said, her voice breaking. "People are already saying wicked things, and I cannot, will not, allow my son's existence to ruin the life of a man who showed us nothing but kindness." The sincerity of her words hit Lionel like a blow. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Annabel, listen to me. I do not care what they say. I do not care about their judgments. You say that now," she murmured, "but society does not forget, and when the whispers grow louder, you will suffer more than I can bear to witness." Lionel's jaw clenched. The fear he had carried for years, fear of disappointment, betrayal, humiliation, surged forward, battling against the fire Annabel had ignited in him. "I can protect you," he insisted. Annabel looked up at him, and for a single breathtaking moment he saw everything she felt reflected in her eyes. Gratitude, admiration, longing, and a deep, consuming affection she did not dare name. "You already have," she whispered. "More than anyone ever has." He reached out, his hand trembling as he brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. It was the barest touch, feather-light, reverent, but it set her entire body trembling. The lantern above them flickered, casting shifting shadows across their faces. "Annabel," he breathed, her name escaping him like a confession, her lips parted, her breath quickening. But then she stepped back. Lionel's hand fell to his side. "My future is not here," she said softly. "Not now. I must protect my child, and you must protect the life you are destined for." Destined. The word pierced him. He forced himself to speak, though his voice felt thick. "And what of what I want?" Annabel closed her eyes, pain carving itself into her features. "What you want is clouded by pity and circumstance. I cannot remain here hoping for something that might ruin us both." Lionel stared at her, stunned. "Is that truly what you believe?" Annabel pressed a kiss to Samuel's brow, her tears slipping silently onto his blanket. "I believe," she whispered, "that if I stay, I will destroy the fragile peace you fight to maintain." Lionel's heart splintered. The train whistle blew a second time, louder, urgent. Annabel lifted her suitcase with trembling fingers. Lionel's breath fractured. "Annabel, do not go." She looked at him then, with a sorrow so profound it nearly brought him to his knees. "If I stay," she whispered, "I will lose myself, and you will lose far more." The conductor called out, announcing departure. Annabel took a step toward the carriage. Lionel felt something inside him tear. "Please," he said, the word escaping him before pride could stop it. "Do not leave like this." She stopped, turned. The platform fell silent around them, swallowed by the weight of their unspoken truth. "You changed something in me," Lionel admitted, his voice breaking, "and I do not know how to exist as I did before." Annabel's tears fell freely now. "And you changed everything in me," she whispered. "But we are not free to choose what our hearts want." Her courage began to crumble. She turned abruptly, lifting her suitcase onto the train. Lionel took a step forward, as though his body refused to let her go, but his feet froze. The haunting memory of his wife's betrayal surged forward, chaining him with fear. If he reached for Annabel now, if he allowed himself to hope, he risked losing the last shield he had around his heart. Annabel stepped into the carriage. Lionel's vision blurred as the door closed. The train lurched. "Annabel!" he shouted suddenly, the name tearing from his chest, raw and desperate. She rushed to the window, pressing her hand against the glass. Lionel mirrored the gesture. Their palms aligned, separated by a thin pain, eyes locked. He felt something inside him shatter. She felt something inside her die, and then the train began to move. Annabel's face slowly drifted past him. Her gaze lingered as long as it could, pleading, apologizing, loving silently. Samuel slept on her shoulder, unaware that his mother's heart was breaking. Lionel stood alone on the platform as the last carriage disappeared into the fog. His breath trembled, his hands shaking. He had let her go, the greatest mistake of his life. Night settled over Bath, stronger than before, cold and unforgiving. Lionel returned home with a hollow ache in his chest. He entered his study, bracing himself against the desk as grief crashed through him. Then anger followed, fierce, righteous anger. He would not lose her to lies. He would not allow Lady Henrietta's cruelty to stand. Lionel summoned Walter Pembroke at once. "We begin tonight," he said, voice carved from fire and resolve. "Find me every servant who saw the brooch, every witness, every document, every whisper." Walter blinked. "Tonight, Your Grace." "Tonight," Lionel repeated, his jaw firm. "For the first time in years, I will use my influence not to quiet society, but to expose it." And so Lionel began his hunt for the truth. Testimonies were collected. A maid confessed under pressure. Documents surfaced. Henrietta's name appeared over and over, stitched into every lie. Lionel worked through the night, refusing to rest until every fragment of corruption lay exposed. He had lost Annabel, but he would not lose justice. Not again. Not ever. Bath, in the year 1869, glittered beneath 1,000 gas lamps as evening settled across the city. Carriages rolled through Queen Square like dark beetles gliding over polished stone, their wheels clattering in steady rhythm. Inside the most opulent townhouse of the district, Lady Farnsworth's residence, a grand assembly was underway, the kind of evening where lace gloves, champagne coupes, and carefully sharpened whispers were the true currency of society. It was the perfect place for triumph, and the perfect place for ruin. The ballroom glowed with gold light reflecting off crystal chandeliers, their delicate prisms scattering flecks of color across painted ceilings. Women in gowns of silk and taffeta stood in elegant clusters, their jewels shimmering like stars. Men in tailored coats conversed in low voices, pretending civility while hiding their hunger for gossip. A quartet played a gentle waltz in the corner, though few listened. Tonight, Bath's elite had gathered to congratulate themselves on their refinement. In mere moments, Lionel Astorbury, Duke of Winthorpe, would disassemble that illusion. He entered just as the musicians paused between pieces, his presence sweeping through the ballroom like a sudden gust extinguishing candles. Conversations halted, fans froze mid-wave. Heads pivoted toward him as though drawn by an invisible thread. Lionel wore a formal evening coat of deep midnight blue, its cuffs embroidered subtly in silver. His shoulders were squared, his jaw set in a line of unyielding purpose. His eyes, those unmistakable steel-grey eyes, held a storm that made even the bravest men step aside. Lady Farnsworth hurried toward him, curtsying with an expression that flickered between delight and terror. "Your Grace, what an unexpected—" "I am not here for pleasantries," Lionel said, his voice calm enough to frighten. "Gather, everyone." Lady Farnsworth blinked. "Everyone?" "Everyone." His tone allowed no opposition. Servants scurried, guests whispered. Within minutes, the ballroom had arranged itself into a wide semicircle facing Lionel like a tribunal awaiting judgment. Among them stood Mrs. Caldwell, breathing anxiously into her gloved hand, and Lady Henrietta Forsyth, shimmering in pale gold silk, her expression a practiced mask of poise. Lionel lifted a leather portfolio in his hand, a simple object yet heavy with consequence. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "I have come to correct an injustice that has taken root in our city, an injustice born not of truth, but of envy, malice and manipulation." A ripple spread through the room like wind over water. Lady Henrietta's lips curved slightly, though tension stiffened her neck. Lionel continued, "Many of you have heard the recent gossip surrounding Mrs. Annabel Pierce." A murmur rose, soft, sharp, poisonous. Lionel's eyes narrowed. "You have heard whispers of theft, of impropriety, of schemes meant to entangle someone of my standing." More murmurs. Mrs. Caldwell's eyes glossed with tears. Lionel's voice darkened. "Those rumors are lies." The room stilled. Lionel opened the portfolio and held up the first sheet. A written confession, signed shakily in ink. "This is the sworn statement of Miss Clara Hensley, made in the household of Mrs. Harland." He read aloud, each word slicing clean through the air. "She admits to planting a sapphire brooch in Mrs. Pierce's sewing bag. She admits to being paid for her actions." Gasps burst from several guests. Henrietta's jaw tightened. Lionel lifted the second sheet. "These are testimonies from witnesses who overheard Miss Hensley accepting coin from Lady Henrietta Forsyth." Shock widened across the room. Eyes darted, fans jolted, feet shifted backward. Lionel unfolded the final proof, a small ledger detailing sums paid from Henrietta's private account. The drawer of Lady Henrietta's writing desk contained this ledger. The handwriting is hers. The dates coincide precisely with the false accusations against Mrs. Pierce. Henrietta's composure cracked. "That is falsified," she cried, stepping forward. "Your Grace, you have been deceived. That woman—" "Silence," Lionel said, his tone cold as winter iron. The orchestra conductor shrank against his stand. Henrietta's breath hitched. Lionel stepped closer, his gaze piercing. "You spread venom against an innocent woman. You used your wealth, your influence, and your position to break her livelihood and her spirit. And you did this while cloaking yourself in the guise of propriety." Henrietta trembled, her voice cracking. I only wished to spare you from a trap. She wanted your favor." "She wanted nothing from me," Lionel said sharply. "She wanted only to raise her child in peace." Silence swallowed the room. He turned away from Henrietta, addressing the assembly once more. "Annabel Pierce is a woman of honor," he declared. "She is hard-working, dignified, and undeserving of the cruelty inflicted upon her. You judged her without hesitation, while ignoring the venom at your own feet." The murmurs this time were humbler, tinged with shame. Mrs. Caldwell pressed a trembling hand to her heart. "Bless you," she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. Lionel's gaze swept across the room. "You will all recognize Mrs. Pierce as innocent. You will speak her name with respect, and you will cease every whisper that seeks to tarnish her." Even the most conservative guests, those who prided themselves on rigid moral codes, looked away in discomfort. Confronted with evidence, they could no longer deny the truth. Lady Farnsworth bowed her head. "Your Grace, we were misled. We will make amends." Lionel did not bother to respond. His purpose there was complete. Lady Henrietta stood alone, her gown shimmering like a cage of shattered gold. Her allies stepped away one by one, abandoning her to her disgrace. Within minutes, she had become a pariah in the very ballroom where she had once ruled. Lionel left without another word. He stepped into the night, the crisp chill embracing him like a reprimand and a promise all at once. His breath formed pale clouds as he descended the steps, his coat brushing against his legs with swift movement. He had done what he came for. He had restored Annabel's name. But justice was not enough. He needed her. His heart beat faster as he crossed the courtyard, boots striking hard against the stone. The gas lamps flickered overhead, casting long shadows behind him. He reached his carriage and motioned to the driver with urgency. "To Mrs. Pierce's lodging," Lionel commanded. The horses surged forward, the city blurred around him. The iron railings, the rows of Georgian windows, the flicker of lamplight on wet pavement. Lionel gripped the seat with both hands, breath tight, heart pounding. He had no plan for what he would say, only the desperate need to find her. At last the carriage halted. Lionel descended before the horses had fully stopped, striding toward the door of Annabel's modest brick lodging. Warm light seeped from the ground-floor window, a glow that wrapped his heart in equal parts, comfort and fear. He knocked. Once, twice, a third time. Footsteps approached. The door opened slowly, casting a band of lamplight across the street. Annabel stood in the doorway, not dressed for society, not adorned for admiration, but in her simple house dress, her hair pinned loosely, soft tendrils escaping at her temples. Her cheeks were flushed from packing. A half-filled trunk sat behind her. Her eyes widened. She did not speak. For a moment, neither did he. His breath hitched at the sight of her, so familiar and yet painfully distant. "Mrs. Pierce," he said softly, his voice trembling despite his efforts to steady it. "I have found the truth." Annabel's lips parted. "I heard. There were whispers, but I did not dare hope." Lionel stepped forward, his voice deepening with emotion. "I have exonerated you before all of Bath. Everyone knows you were framed. Lady Henrietta's scheme is exposed." Annabel gasped softly, her eyes filling. "But why would you go through such trouble?" His answer came without hesitation. "Because you deserved justice. Because you deserved truth. Because I could not bear the thought of you living under shame that was never yours." She blinked rapidly, overwhelmed. Lionel's breath softened. "And because I must speak to you. I must tell you something I should have said long before tonight." Annabel's heart thudded in her chest. His eyes glimmered with profound emotion, unguarded at last. "May I come in?" he asked quietly. Annabel hesitated only a second before stepping aside. The door closed behind them with a soft click. The night pressed close outside, but inside a fragile, brilliant hope began to take form, one that neither heartbreak nor scandal would be able to extinguish. Lionel had restored her dignity. Now he would fight for her heart. Bath, in the year 1869, slept beneath a gentle hush as dawn hesitated to break. A faint silver glow clung to the rooftops, casting soft shadows along the narrow streets of the modest district where Annabel Pierce lived. Inside her small lodging, the air carried the scent of drying linen and the quiet melancholy of a woman preparing to disappear from a life she had begun to cherish. Annabel stood beside her half-packed trunk, her hands trembling slightly as she folded Samuel's blanket. Her simple dress of dusty blue clung to her slender figure, rumpled from a night without sleep. Candlelight flickered across her face, revealing the exhaustion beneath her eyes and the fragile resolve gathering in her heart. Her small home was silent, save for the soft breaths of Samuel as he slept curled under his quilt. Boxes sat open, garments folded with practiced care, and spools of thread tucked into cloth pouches as though they were priceless treasures. For Annabel they were. Every item she owned had been earned with sacrifice, persistence, or both. Leaving Bath was not bravery, it was surrender. But she believed it was the only way to protect Lionel's name from the stain her presence had stirred. Even though the Duke had restored her honor before society, she knew the whispers would continue. For those of her class, freedom was often a road paved with tears. She lifted her sewing basket to place it in the trunk when a sudden knock echoed through the quiet room. Her entire body stilled. She told herself it must be the neighbor, Mrs. Hill, checking on her before the morning rush. But something inside her, something deep and trembling, knew it was not. A second knock came, firmer this time. Annabel's breath caught. Her steps felt impossibly heavy as she crossed the room. She hesitated with her hand on the latch, her pulse fluttering beneath her skin like a trapped bird. She opened the door. Lionel Astorbury stood before her. He looked as though he had been carved from the very dawn behind him. Tall, powerful, breathless from urgency and illuminated by the pale glow of first light. His hair, touched by the wind, lay slightly tousled. His coat of deep charcoal was buttoned in haste, and his eyes, those unmistakable grey eyes, were filled with a tumult of fear, determination, and yearning. Annabel's hand gripped the doorframe to steady herself. "Your Grace." "Annabel," he said, his voice cracking not with weakness, but with emotion he could no longer contain. He stepped inside without waiting for permission, though his gaze asked for forgiveness even before his feet crossed the threshold. The door closed behind him softly. For a moment neither spoke. The small room suddenly felt too intimate, too full of memories, too full of truths left unsaid. Lionel looked at the trunk, the folded garments, the sewing baskets ready to leave. Realization struck him like a blow. "You were leaving," he whispered, again, without allowing me to speak. Annabel lowered her gaze. "I thought it would be easier. For you." "For me?" Lionel repeated, almost in disbelief. "Annabel, the moment you stepped onto that train, something in me shattered." She swallowed, her chin trembling. "I did not want to be the cause of any more pain." "You were the cause of my awakening," he said, stepping closer. Annabel breathed in sharply, but her feet did not move. She felt the heat of him, the weight of his confession approaching. Lionel took another step forward, so close she had to tilt her head to meet his eyes. "I am not here out of obligation," he said slowly, searching her face as though committing every detail to memory. "I am not here because society demands I restore your name. I have already done that." Annabel blinked rapidly, tears gathering. "I am here," he continued, "because I cannot imagine a life where you are not in it." Her breath caught. Lionel lifted a hand, hesitated for a heartbeat, then brushed the back of his fingers along her cheek. The touch was feather-light, more reverent than any embrace she had ever known. You brought warmth to a heart I believed frozen. You brought meaning to a life built on duty and appearances. You showed me courage without armor, resilience without pride, and kindness without expectation. He lowered his hand, though his body leaned as if drawn irresistibly closer to her. "Annabel Pierce," he said softly, "I love you." The words, spoken by a duke, a man of immense power, a man whose heart had been locked for years, fell into the small room like a fragile miracle. Annabel pressed a trembling hand to her lips. Tears slipped down her cheeks in silent rivers. "Lionel," she whispered, his name escaping her as though it had lived in her throat for months, waiting for release. He exhaled shakily. "I love you with a devotion that terrifies me, but the thought of letting you go terrifies me more." Annabel reached out, her fingertips brushing his coat sleeve, her touch hesitant, tender, trembling with emotion. "I have loved you too," she confessed in a breathless whisper, "but I feared what it would cost you. I feared that a seamstress, an ordinary woman, could not belong in your world." Lionel took her hand gently, lifting it as though it were the most precious thing he had ever touched. "You belong wherever your heart finds peace, and mine has found its peace in you." A soft sound stirred behind them, Samuel shifting in his sleep. Lionel looked toward the small cot, his expression softening into something immeasurably tender. "May I?" he asked. Annabel nodded. Lionel crossed the room, lowering himself onto one knee beside Samuel's cot. The child slept soundly, his soft curls pressed against the pillow. Lionel gazed at him with a mixture of reverence and aching affection. He placed a hand over his own heart. "Samuel," he whispered, though the boy could not hear him, "I want you in my life as I want your mother, not from duty, not from public expectation, but from love, from a desire to protect you both and give you a home where you will never fear hunger or shame or sorrow fashioned by others." He lifted his gaze to Annabel. "I vow to be a father to him, if he will have me, and a partner to you, if you will allow me." Annabel covered her mouth with trembling fingers. Emotion swept through her like a fierce wind, cracking every wall she had ever built to survive. Lionel rose slowly and returned to her. He held both her hands now, his grip warm, steady, reverent. "So I ask you, Annabel," he murmured, "not as a duke, not as a man above your station, but as a man who has found his soul in yours. Will you marry me?" Her breath broke on a soft sob. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Lionel, I will." His eyes closed as relief, gratitude and fierce tenderness washed through him. When he opened them again, the storm inside them had transformed into brilliant calm. He cupped her face gently, and their lips met in a kiss that held no urgency, only devotion. A kiss slow enough to feel every unspoken word, every healed wound, every promise of a future once unthinkable. It was a kiss that rewrote the destiny of two lives. Weeks later, Bath buzzed with shock that transformed gradually into admiration. Not because a duke had married a seamstress, but because he had loved her openly, fiercely, and without bowing to the weight of society. Mrs. Caldwell cried tears of joy through the entire ceremony. She embraced Annabel with motherly pride and declared that moral strength was a nobler crown than any inherited title. Samuel, dressed in a small suit gifted by Lionel, held onto the Duke's hand with unwavering trust. And Annabel, now Annabel Astorbury, walked through the grand doorway of Winthorpe House with her head lifted, not in arrogance, but in courage. The once intimidating mansion now felt like a sanctuary, warmed by new purpose and new love. Lionel stood beside her, his expression softened by gratitude so deep it reshaped his very soul. He took her hand. "Welcome home, my love," he whispered. Together, they crossed the threshold. And thus began a legend that Bath would retell for generations, the Duke who found redemption in the arms of a seamstress. and the seamstress who reshaped the destiny of a duke. Bath, 7 years after the scandal that once shook its drawing rooms, lay bathed in the golden hush of a late summer afternoon. The city had softened with time, its whispers gentler, its judgments tempered by the quiet rain of compassion that had rippled outward from one unlikely love story. Winthorpe House, once a fortress of solemn dignity, now pulsed with life. Laughter drifted through its gardens, mingling with birdsong and the scent of roses Annabel herself had planted. The ivy climbing the stone walls had grown thicker, richer, as though echoing the fullness of the lives within. On a wide blanket beneath the oak tree at the centre of the lawn, Annabel Astorbury sat sewing a tiny hem onto a child's sleeve. Her brown hair, slightly lighter from years of sunlight, was still gathered in the soft chignon Lionel adored. The fine lines beside her eyes had deepened, marks of joy, not sorrow. She wore a simple cream dress, embroidered delicately at the cuffs, and her hands moved with the same gentle precision that had once kept her and Samuel alive. "Mother, look how high I can climb!" Annabel looked up, heart swelling. Samuel, now 11, hung from a low branch of the oak, his little boots kicking in triumph. His curls were longer, his face more daring, his laughter free of the shadows that once clung to him. "Careful!" Annabel called gently. "Your father will scold me if you break an arm." Samuel laughed and jumped down safely, sprinting across the lawn just as the patio doors opened. Lionel Astorbury stepped outside, sunlight spilling over him like a blessing. He had aged, of course, his temples now touched with silver, but the years had carved strength and serenity into his features rather than weariness. His once cold gaze had warmed into something steady and luminous, especially when it fell on his wife. He crossed the grass and leaned down to press a tender kiss to her temple. 7 years, and still I find you more beautiful each day, he murmured. Annabel felt her cheeks warm, just as they had when he first said the words, the night he confessed his love. "You are incorrigible," she whispered, though her smile betrayed her delight. With a soft laugh, Lionel lowered himself beside her, stretching his long legs with the ease of a man unburdened. He reached gently for the tiny sleeve lying in Annabel's lap. "Another tear?" he asked, examining the fabric. Annabel's eyes softened. "Our daughter has inherited her brother's restlessness." As if summoned, a high-pitched giggle echoed from behind the rose bushes. A little girl burst into view, dark curls bouncing, blue ribbons flying loose from her hair. Olivia Astorbury, 5 years old and full of spirited determination, barreled into her father's arms with such force he nearly toppled backward. "Papa, I raced the dog." Lionel chuckled, lifting her easily. "And did you win?" Olivia nodded vigorously, her curls bobbing. "Of course, I always win." Annabel watched them with quiet wonder. A duke, once feared for his icy demeanor, now letting a small girl climb him like a tree. A home, once defined by silence and duty, now ringing with limitless love. This was the life she had never allowed herself to dream. This was the life she had built with him. In the distance, a carriage approached along the gravel path. Mrs. Eleanor Caldwell stepped out, moving more slowly than before, but with the same grace that had once saved Annabel from ruin. Her silver hair was neatly pinned, and she walked with the assistance of a cane, one Lionel had personally crafted from polished wood. Annabel rose to greet her, embracing her gently. "My dear," Mrs. Caldwell said warmly, "your garden grows lovelier each year." "That is because you helped me plant it," Annabel replied, eyes shining. Mrs. Caldwell's gaze drifted to the children. "And look at them, proof that some stories do earn their happily ever afters." Annabel squeezed her hand. "I owe you more than I can ever repay." "You owe me nothing," Mrs. Caldwell whispered. "You repaid me the day you stood tall in a world that tried to break you." They turned toward the house together. Inside the grand halls, portraits of past dukes hung in solemn rows, but a new painting had been added beside them. It depicted Lionel, Annabel, Samuel, and little Olivia, all surrounded by blooming wisteria. Lionel had insisted on commissioning it the year Olivia was born. "You belong in these halls," he had told her, "because you rebuilt what they once lacked, heart." Not all stories had ended so gracefully. Lady Henrietta Forsyth had returned to the countryside following her social downfall. Rumour claimed she lived in quiet isolation now, her family estates maintained but devoid of visitors. She rarely travelled, rarely hosted, rarely smiled. Her fate had become a quiet warning whispered through bath salons. Cruelty is a debt life always collects. Bath itself had changed subtly as the years passed. Society grew slower to judge, quicker to show compassion. Lionel's public defence of Annabel had challenged old traditions, proving that class alone was not the measure of character. Other noblemen began supporting charity work more openly. Women of modest means found new opportunities in workshops and guilds. And though the city would never shed all its pride, it had learned humility in the wake of a duke's courage and a seamstress's grace. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in amber and rose, Lionel and Annabel walked together through the gardens. Olivia ran ahead chasing fireflies, while Samuel trailed behind, sketching the flowers in his little notebook, a habit Annabel cherished. Lionel took her hand, lifting it to his lips. 7 years, he murmured, and every day I thank God you did not stay on that train. Annabel leaned her head gently against his shoulder. 7 years, she echoed, and every day I love you more than the last. The wind carried the scent of roses. Leaves rustled with a soft applause, as though the world itself celebrated them. Annabel paused, turning to admire their home, its warm windows, its open doors, its laughter, a home once built on lineage, now built on love. "It still feels like a miracle," she whispered. Lionel wrapped his arm around her waist, drawing her close. "No," he said softly. "It feels like destiny." Together they walked toward Winthorpe House, where 2 children waited, where Mrs. Caldwell smiled from the parlour, where the future stretched before them, bright, promising, and shaped by choices brave enough to defy the world. And thus the legend endured. The Duke who found redemption in the heart of a seamstress, and the seamstress who transformed a legacy into love. When we close the final page of this story, we are reminded that true love is not born in perfection. It grows in courage, in resilience, and in the unwavering choice to see the light in someone others overlook. Annabel and Lionel showed us that dignity can survive the harshest judgment, and that the heart becomes stronger every time it chooses compassion over fear. Their journey teaches us that healing is possible, that second chances are real, and that the bridges we dare to cross, despite class, pain, or past wounds, can lead to a destiny far greater than anything society expects of us. If their love touched you, inspired you, or brought a little warmth to your day, I'd love to know. Write the word courage in the comments so I can see who stayed with this story until the very end. Your participation helps this channel reach more people who also love emotional, dramatic, deeply human romances. If you enjoyed walking through Winthorpe House and witnessing this love overcome every barrier, please share this story with someone who needs hope, comfort, or a reminder that love still transforms lives. And don't forget, there are more heartfelt historical romances waiting for you. I've left some wonderful recommendations in the cards. Thank you for being here, for feeling every emotion, and for keeping these stories alive with your presence. I can't wait to see you in the next tale.